women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey, we made it. It is Friday. And it's the Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters, those of you who have questions about the Catholic faith. Maybe you're not quite sure how to get those questions answered. Believe me, I understand if you've never been a Catholic or if you're a fallen away Catholic, the last thing you want to do sometimes is to actually walk into a Catholic church and start asking questions. That may be a little intimidating. Well, it's not intimidating if you're asking a question of us here on the radio. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And of course, you can email us anytime you wish. The email address ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. In fact, on Monday, we're going to be airing a mailbag program on Martin Luther King Day when we are closed officially. But it's a great opportunity to handle some of those longer emails that we do receive from time to time. Again, the phone number 833-288-EWTN. Looks like we have 3 lines available right now. Charles Beery is our producer. We also have Ryan Penny as our phone screener, and Michael McCall is handling social media today. He'll be glad to pass on any messages you may want to transmit to us via YouTube or Facebook Live. We're streaming there right now, along with all of our other great platforms. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
You know what? Doing well. We have a march, a pro-life march this weekend here in Birmingham. I know that you've participated in that over the years.
Many years.
Yep. We've done it a number of times as well, and I'm sure there are a number of other such things going on around the country, including Los Angeles. And we're going to be broadcasting that. We'll give you a little more information about that a little bit later on this hour.
Fantastic.
But anyway, now it looks like there's 2 lines open right now at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to lead off here with an email. This is from Keith, kind of a tough one. I divorced my wife 10 years ago after an adulterous relationship with another man in the church. She was the love of my life. She walked out from the home and our children and never returned. She has been living with another man for about 4 years. We have had very little contact over the years. Well, I now understand, as a Catholic, the church views us, she and I, as still being married, even though I do have a civil divorce. Do I still retain spiritual responsibility for my ex-wife? And if I was granted an annulment, would this be resolved? By the way, I have no plans to remarry. Thanks, Keith.
Okay, Keith, thanks. I appreciate the question. So your situation right now, the church presumes that you are validly married. And in terms of your responsibilities, you are responsible to be faithful to your vows, even if she's not. Mm-hmm. And so you love your wife, you want her salvation, and you will, do good to her as it is possible. Now, when there is adultery, infidelity, this is a horrible wound at the heart of a marriage, and the church recognizes that it may be an impossibility, an absolute impossibility for a married couple, to continue to live together when one of them has been unfaithful, particularly when one's continuing to be unfaithful. And so the church says you may have to actually obtain a civil divorce to protect yourself and to protect your children. Mm-hmm. That doesn't eliminate the sacramental bond of marriage. It doesn't eliminate there being a valid marriage there, but it's just something you have to do to protect yourself and your kids. And that obviously is going to radically change the context in which you can be faithful to your marriage vows. Things that you can do are, you can pray for her.
Oh, yeah.
You can pray for her, and you should. Now, if you obtain an annulment, that would be the church's verdict that you were never married to begin with. And if you were never married to begin with, then you would not have the obligations of marriage towards this woman. And I can't advise you what to do in that situation. I can't advise you what to do.
Sure.
Right now the church doesn't question the validity of your marriage because you haven't. And so we presume that you have a valid marriage. And even though there's a very deep wound at the heart of your relationship, if you are in fact validly married, which I presume to be the case, then the grace of the sacrament is effective in your life.
Yeah.
It is. And so what is that grace? Well, the sacrament of marriage gives us grace to live our marriage vows generously in an ecclesial state, as a ministry of the Catholic Church, both to your family and to the world. And it's in imitation of the union of Christ and His church. And that union was Christ, the spouse, giving himself in sacrifice for the salvation of the church, for the salvation of others, even those who rejected him. And so the sacrament of matrimony is effective in your life in this way at this time, giving you the grace to make this really heroic, I think, sacrifice of fidelity and chastity and love with deep suffering, even on behalf of someone who has rejected you.
Absolutely. Well, we do thank you, Keith, for your very honest and very forthright email, and please know that we will certainly keep you and your wife and your family in our prayers. It is called to communion here on EWTN. I'm going to give you the phone number, and it is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside of North America, dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of people in the 21st century, they dig the texting. Well, you can do that as well. Text the letters EWTN to 55000, EWTN to 55000, and we will take it from there. In a moment here, we'll be talking with Patty in Longview, Texas, checking us out today on the EWTN app. Looks like we've got other calls in the process of being screened. Ryan will take care of that, as he does every day for us. Does a super job. We have the best team in radio. That's all there is to it. Anyway, when a line becomes available, the phone number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. It's the Friday edition of Call to Communion.
Hi, I'm Brian Patrick. Join me, Dr. Matthew Bunson, and Father Thomas Petrie for The Church Alive.
It's not a happy time at the moment in Washington for the people who go to the Basilica.
Father, you mentioned a forensic investigation. Define forensic in this context.
I think it simply means they're going to be looking if there's any victims who have not come forward, if there's any substance to the allegations.
In other words, we're really digging down into what could be the allegations.
Yes. The Church Alive, tomorrow, 7 a.m. and 1 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
He was a Jesuit, a cardinal, and a doctor of the Church.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
St. Robert Bellarmine is honored for his immense contributions to theology, including helping to draft 2 important catechisms that defended church teachings during the Protestant revolt. Pope Clement VIII named Bellarmine a cardinal because, as the Pope put it, Bellarmine had not his equal for learning.
For more about the Doctors of the Church, visit doctorsofthechurch.com.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
You know, I have never seen women who want to be equal absolutely degrading themselves. And yet the media degrades your nature, your beauty as a woman, your goodness. Let us pray. At some point, our dear Lord touches their hearts.
For more information on Mother Angelica, visit Religious Catalog at EWTNRC.com.
Call to communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. We were talking earlier about some of the pro-life marches, Walk for Life. One of them going on tomorrow is in Los Angeles, and it's One Life LA, and I believe this is their 6th annual walk right through the streets of downtown Los Angeles. We're going to be carrying it right here on EWTN Radio Classics, beginning at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That'll also be on EWTN Television. Celebrate the beauty and the dignity of every human life from conception to natural death. We'll also have Archbishop Jose Gomez on the air. We will have a number of pro-life speakers coming to you from downtown Los Angeles. Check it out. It is hosted by our own Doug Keck and Father Joseph Mary Wolf. 4:30 p.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN's television network and also on EWTN Radio Classics. Sounds like a winner to me. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Patty in Longview, Texas, listening on the EWTN app. Hey there, Patty. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Sure.
I would like to know, what is the Catholic view of the account of the ages of the people described in Genesis chapter 5? Is it literally that they lived 875 years? I've got a friend, and then in chapter 6 it says that God reduces the age to 120, then reduces it to 80. And we had a guest last night at home. He is a Baptist, and he tells me that the Bible has to be taken literal. There's no other way. It's a literal account of everything. And he contends that these people did live 875 years. And what is it? I'm a Catholic. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I sometimes have a little bit of difficulty explaining our beliefs. You make it sound so easy. So if you can help me,
sure,
understand, we don't think that these people lived 875 years, right?
Well, here, let me answer it this way, if I might, and I appreciate the question. Thank you very much. So the Catholic Church does almost never does the Church dogmatically teach that a passage of Scripture must be interpreted in a certain way. Almost never. There are a few places where it is necessary to hold a particular interpretation. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. John chapter 6. When Jesus says, "My flesh is real food and my blood is real drink," he meant what he said, and he said what he meant.
That's it.
That's about the sacrament of the Eucharist, and you have to hold it that way. That we're talking about the substantial presence of Christ in the Eucharist. That is a place where the Church says, yep, you got to understand this passage of Scripture in this way. There may be all kinds of other implications you can draw out of the text, but it can't be anything at variance with the doctrine of transubstantiation. But the rest, most of the Bible is not like that, okay? And the Bible exists in a lot of literary genre, mm-hmm. and the right way to make use of them, to apply them to our spiritual lives, begins with a recognition of the kind of writing that's being done. And when it comes to the book of Genesis in general, right, and I'll come to the question of the age of the antediluvians in a moment, but when it comes to the book of Genesis in general, the consensus of Catholic theologians and of the Catholic Church down through the centuries is that it was not the intention, I'm actually quoting St. Augustine here, not the intention of the Spirit of God, who spoke through the prophets, to teach men anything that would not be of use to them for their salvation, right? And he has in mind the account of the creation and the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all of that. And he's dealing with the question St. Augustine is, and this is his book on the literal interpretation of Genesis, that when the interpreter encounters passages of the Bible that seem at variance with what he knows from natural reason, then he's not required to interpret the Bible in a way that would do violence to his reason. Right? Now, sometimes we have to really discern what do we know rationally. Like we might think, well, rationally, people don't rise from the dead. All right. Well, but we got historical evidence that Jesus did. So I may have to reconfigure what's actually rational here. Mm-hmm. All right. But I'm not required to take just a bare literal interpretation of every text of the Bible and then throw out what reason might deliver to me. Okay. And there are clues within the text of Genesis itself that more is at work here than just a literal genealogy of the ancestors of Abraham. That there may be there are figures and types embedded in the numerology that have a spiritual significance. And I'll give you one. All right, we actually can identify the first human character in the Bible who we're told dies at 120 years of age. And you're right, God reduces the human lifespan to 120. And then, lo and behold, it's Moses. We find out later that it's Moses is the guy that lives that age. And Moses is a type of Christ. He's not Christ. He is not a Messiah. But by type, I mean typological.
Sure.
He's one that prefigures the coming of Christ as, the prophet. But he's also sort of like the archetypal human man, writ large and perfect, under the domain of the law. And there are clues like that within the text that, okay, there's some prefigurement going on here. It's a literary stylistic technique to drive a narrative about the identity of the people of God. And the antediluvians would seem to correspond to tribes of the earth. And there are a lot of factors that go into how we read this text and how we interpret it that suggest that more is at work than just, God wants to give us this ancient genealogy. And, keep in mind, St. Augustine's rule, like the point of Scripture is to orient us in our relationship with God for the sake of our salvation. Like, it's really irrelevant to me how long Methuselah lived. That has absolutely no impact on the question of, say, my justice or charity or my fidelity of my wife or my purity of heart, right? Unless that is somehow a figure that plays in to a story, a narrative of God's redemptive activity in the world that I can apply directly to my life. So we don't. The short answer is, Church really doesn't tell you how you have to interpret that passage.
Yeah.
And there have been Catholics in history who have read that very literally and said, okay, Methuselah lived 900-something years. Others have read and said, no, this is a literary type, and it's serving an allegorical function within a narrative that's aiming towards the call of Abraham and Moses. We're going to work that out in other ways. Both of those are allowable interpretations of that text.
Hope that's helpful for you, Patty. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Very busy phones today on this Friday edition of Call to Communion. Here is Naomi now in Missouri City, Texas, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Hey, Naomi, what's on your mind today?
I have a daughter-in-law. Well, she just came into the family, but before that, we had an issue of over faith, and she was saying that she believes that there's a difference between Roman Catholics, the big C, and Catholic Church, the small churches, and that she believes that Roman Catholics are a denomination of the Catholic Church, just as much as Anglicans are and Lutherans or Methodists. And she believes that the Catholic small church as a whole is not the denomination of the Roman Catholic. So, and it's a universally applicable term for churches which uphold the Christian doctrine as dictated in the Bible.
Oh, okay.
So I've never heard of this, and it literally has floored me in the thinking of this in this way.
Okay.
Yep, I can help you. So I'm very familiar with this point of view. It is very wrong. All right. And here's what motivates this point of view, right? That there are Christians out there that they don't like Rome, they don't like the Pope, they don't like purgatory, they don't want to pray to Mary, they don't like all that Catholic stuff. But they recognize that the claim that, my little denomination is the bee's knees, seems very tendentious and hard to swallow, and even harder to reconcile with the course of Christian history. They know there's this big thing out there, called the history of the faith that includes folks like Augustine and St. Jerome and Basil and Gregory Nazianzus and Nyssa and the Desert Fathers, and they want a piece of that, right? They want to be able to associate themselves with all these great Catholic heroes down through the centuries without biting the bullet and going all the way across the Tiber and joining Rome, right? So what they do is they invent this idea that there's this larger superstructure called, small c Catholicism, of which they're an integral part, so they can lay claim to the history without having to actually submit to the authority of the Bishop of Rome.
Dessert without dinner.
Yeah, and it's an old position. It's an old argument. An important version of it emerged in the 17th century Anglican community, and then had a rebirth in 19th century Anglicanism that said, these Oxford movement Anglicans would claim, well, there are three branches of the Catholic Church: the Anglican, the Roman, and the Eastern, the Byzantine or the Greek, right? And the problem was neither the so-called other two branches recognized the theory, right? They were like, "Oh, sorry, guys, no," right? But it really was an attempt to claim antiquity and continuity for a community that was novel, recent, and way out of continuity. All right. So how do we respond? Like, how do you answer that charge? Well, your daughter-in-law has appealed to the Bible. She appealed to the Bible. Mm-hmm. Is that view biblical? Is that biblical? Does Jesus ever establish that there is some sort of larger ephemeral superstructure in which we can find diverse denominations that disagree on matters of faith and practice, and that they're all somehow allied, to one big amorphous thing called, small c Catholicism? Is that a biblical view? Jesus ever articulate that? The apostles ever articulate that? By no means. Quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. St. Paul actually addresses that as a possibility in 1 Corinthians and rejects it out of hand. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 10, he says, we have to agree on everything. Everything. And he points to the liturgical practice of the universal church as a binding norm in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 16. He says, if anyone wants to be contentious and have another practice, we don't have another practice, nor do the churches of God. Like, you've got to be on board with the church universal in uniformity. And you can't have sects and factions. You can't say, I follow Luther, I follow Calvin, I follow Wesley, I follow Augustine, and we're all just one big happy family that way. No, he says, no, we follow Christ, and that has a determinate meaning, right? That's what the whole letter is about. Jesus makes no allowance for this kind of ecclesial diversity. He said to St. Peter, you're Peter, and on this rock I build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And then he actually articulates the possibility that people can be kicked out of that church. In Matthew 18, he says, if you see your brother and son, he doesn't listen to you, you kick him out of the church. All right? How is it possible to realize Christ's command to excommunicate? Because that's integral to the notion of church that Christ established, that there is a determinate body, and you can be in it or you can be out of it. How do you realize that promise if there's not a visible, objective society into which you can be inserted and from which you can be expelled? It's impossible, right? Christ establishes the church, not Christianity, not this amorphous thing, institutes authorities that have the power of binding and loosing, and a promise that they will continue to the end of the age, of divine assistance until the end of the age. That's Catholicism, is what Scripture teaches. And I'm talking Roman Catholicism, with Peter as the foundation of the church's unity. Not this amorphous business is not found in the Bible.
Okay. Naomi, thank you so much for your call. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Ben now in Cincinnati, listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Ben, what's on your mind today?
Hey, thanks for taking my call. I really enjoy the show a lot. My question has to do with the atonement. I've heard Dr. Anders talk a number of times about penal substitution and its inadequacies. And I think if I understand correctly, I think what I've heard you say is that the Catholic view is more like something like Christ substitutes his love and obedience for our disobedience rather than stands in as kind of the punishment or the punished. But my question is, does that then make the death of Christ a kind of accidental feature of the atonement? And if that's not correct, could you kind of sort me out?
Yeah,
That's
thanks.
my question.
You're onto something and not at the same time. So St. Thomas Aquinas actually addresses this very question. Was it necessary for Christ to die for us to be redeemed? And his answer, and this is the Catholic position, is that, well, yes and no. Given the dispensation that God made, given the world that he created and the plan of redemption that God established, this is the means of our salvation that God gave us. Could God have created another universe in which we were redeemed in some other way? Well, yeah, he's God. He can do what he wants.
Sure.
Right? But this way was fitting. It was the most fitting. And so it doesn't, the crucifixion as the means of our redemption does not exist because of some metaphysical necessity imposed on God, but because this is the story that God wrote.
Right. Ben, thank you so much for your call. We do appreciate that. In a moment, we'll be talking with Susan in Mission Hills, Kansas. Lots more straight ahead on the Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN, the Global Catholic Network. Stay with us.
Dr. Scott Hahn.
Jesus gave us the most perfect of prayers. It's always prayed by the Catholic Church after the consecration and right before communion, but always there at the climax of the Mass.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
EWTN is now on Twitter. Get short, timely messages from EWTN on your computer or cell phone. It's easy to stay up to date on a wide variety of topics. Pro-life news, Vatican announcements, catechesis, apologetics, the latest EWTN programming, and more. You can link to EWTN on Twitter from our homepage or go to twitter.com/EWTN. At work, at home, at school, and on the road. Stay connected to your world with EWTN's Twitter page.
It's time for Family Man with Dr. Gregory Popchak.
Anxiety disorders affect 20% of Americans, and many take anti-anxiety medications in an attempt to find relief. But surprisingly, a new study from the University of New Zealand examining the effectiveness of different types of anxiety therapies found that compared with using medication alone to treat anxiety, or even medication combined with therapy, anxious patients who received cognitive behavior therapy alone experienced the most relief of all three groups. The study found that anxious patients can tend to lean too heavily on medication to help them feel calm, and because of that, can struggle to develop the skills therapy could otherwise afford them. By contrast, patients who received counseling alone worked harder to learn skills that help them create a more peaceful life. If you're suffering from anxiety but not currently receiving counseling, contact a faithful therapist who can make sure you're getting the best care possible. I'm Dr. Greg Popchak, but you can call me Family Man.
To discover more ways faith can enrich your life, visit CatholicCounselors.com.
I'm Jerry Usher.
And I'm Debbie Georgiani.
Join us for Take Two with Jerry and Debbie at noon Eastern with an encore at midnight Eastern.
Now back to more of Call to Communion.
The Friday edition of Call to Communion in progress here on EWTN, the Global Catholic Network. I want to give one more shout out here to One Life LA, which we will be carrying tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. That is the Walk for Life coming to you live from Los Angeles, and that'll be at 4:30 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Television and EWTN Radio Classics. Do check it out. It'll be a good one. Let's go back to the phones now and talk with Susan in Mission Hills, Kansas, listening on Catholic Radio Network. Hey, Susan, what's on your mind today?
Hi there. Will God answer the prayer of anyone who prays to him, a believer or non-believer, atheist or agnostic?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. It depends on the person and the prayer, right? Oh. So God will answer the faithful, contrite, repentant prayer that asks God for the grace necessary for salvation. That's the prayer that God will infallibly answer. I'll add the qualification of persevering. The persevering, faithful, contrite, repentant prayer that asks God for the grace necessary to get us to heaven. That prayer God will infallibly answer. God, I would like a new Lamborghini. Not likely going to get that one. Unless for some odd reason God intends a Lamborghini as an instrumental cause in the path of your salvation for reasons that would certainly escape my ability to fathom, right? And so a better way of asking this, or getting at what you're asking, I think, is to say, well, is there any advantage to a Catholic in the life of prayer in comparison to, say, an atheist or some other religious tradition? Or are we all on equal footing? Well, the Catholic does have an advantage, right? And to begin with, what I just articulated, the conditions of effective prayer, is known to the Catholic in a way that it's not known to others. So, if you look at, say, the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, what did the prophets of Baal do? Well, they thought that they could move God to miracles by cutting themselves and performing acts of superstition. The Aztecs used to offer human sacrifice to what they understood to be God, to keep the sun rising in the morning. I mean, there's an unbelievable amount of superstition in the world that has gone on under the name of religion, and God's verdict on all of that has been, I hate it. I hate it. God does not respond to, say, human sacrifice, or to people cutting themselves in some act of superstition to move him to send down fire to burn up their enemies, or whatever it might be. So there are a lot of prayers God's not going to answer because they're wrong motivated or they're superstitious. The Catholic is at an enormous advantage in knowing the difference between piety and superstition. Second, the Catholic is blessed with the virtue of the sacraments, the power of grace in our lives, that gives us the charity and the contrition necessary to make our prayers effective. Because see, if we don't have faith and repentance, then we're not going to get the grace of conversion flowing into our life. If we don't have charity and grace, our prayers are also going to lack efficacy. St. James says the prayer of a righteous man is more effective than the prayer of an unrighteous man. And the gift of the Catholic faith to us is the grace to bring us that righteousness that will make our prayers more efficacious. So an atheist or some other religious tradition can pray to God for grace and salvation and be heard. But the Catholic is still at a very great objective advantage in the life of prayer.
Appreciate your call, Susan. It is Friday's edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Stacy now in New York City, listening on the EWTN app, a free download. Stacy, what's on your mind today?
Good afternoon, guys. Hope things are okay. And my question is, Mark 13:30. I've been reading him, and by chance somebody said C.S. Lewis said that was most embarrassing chapter in the Bible. Not that I believe that, but maybe you could shed some light on Mark chapter 13:30 about this generation will not pass away till the end of times come, something like that. Maybe.
Yeah, I think we're citing the wrong text because that's not what my Mark 15:30 says. But the message, the question still holds, right? So when Jesus says that this generation will not pass away until all these things have been accomplished. So there's Matthew 24 is one version of the Olivet Discourse where Christ makes these apocalyptic prophecies about things that are going to happen. He also says you won't finish going through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes in power. There are a lot of texts about the end of time that would seem to locate the fulfillment of Christ's promises in the first century. So what do you make sense of? How do you make sense of that? Well, a lot of ways to make sense of that. Let me go to the apocalyptic texts about wrath and punishment and all kinds of mayhem being poured out on Jerusalem. Well, that actually happened.
Yeah.
Right? So when Christ says that, the temple's going to be torn down, Jerusalem's going to be surrounded by armies, there'll be suffering untold, incomparable to anything that's happened since the beginning of the world, all that happened in the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. All right? Does that exhaust the significance of that passage? No, it doesn't, because the historical destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which did happen, in the lifetime of the early church, stands for us as a kind of type, an allegory, a symbol of the kind of temporal destruction and spiritual threat that the church remains under for all of time. And Jesus says you won't finish going through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes in power. Well, what coming are we talking about here?
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about the second coming at the end of time when Christ raises the dead. We are talking about the coming of the church in power that was inaugurated at Pentecost. So there are a lot of ways in which these eschatological passages of the New Testament have a kind of initial fulfillment that presage a deeper fulfillment at the end of time.
Okay. Stacy, thanks so much for your call. It is Call to Communion here on EWTN. We have an email now from Brian. Brian says, we all know the story of Abraham and Isaac, in which God praises Abraham for not withholding, quote, his only son. So why does Ishmael get such short shrift? Why, if Abraham is considered such a good role model, do we not pay much attention to how poorly Hagar and Ishmael are treated? God made similar promises about Ishmael being the start of a great nation as well. This is all very bewildering to me. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, so is the question, why do we venerate Abraham as a moral figure, given that Abraham did things that seem morally questionable?
Yes, right? I think that's it.
And the perspective of sacred Scripture is that Abraham believed God and was obedient to him. Right? At the end of the day, that's where the buck stops. So Abraham is living in Ur of the Chaldees.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a pretty good thing going. You know, he's got a lot of flocks and herds, and he's well thought of by his neighbors. And God comes and says, "Leave, pack up, go to the land I'm going to show you."
Mm-hmm.
Abraham becomes a wanderer, a nomad, goes away, follows the call of God, and he knows not what, right? And lives faithful to God as he understands the call. And that's why Abraham is a model to us. Now, there were a lot of things about Abraham's social environment that we can, from the benefit of hindsight, we can look back from the 21st century and go, yuck.
Yeah.
I mean, thank heavens I didn't live in, the ancient nomadic Middle East and have to deal with some of the social institutions that were just the world that Abraham lived in. But what's interesting is that God seems to sort of tolerate some of the superstitions and inequities of ancient Near Eastern society. He does invert them in Abraham's case. So, Abraham lived in a world of human sacrifice. And he believes that's what God intends for him. And God allows him to operate under that false expectation up until the last minute, and then takes the occasion of Abraham's misunderstanding to institute a prophecy of the death of the Messiah, which, of course, was what happened in the case of Abraham. And it would not have been uncommon for men to treat women in a cavalier way as property in the ancient world, to be, shoved off or taken on at my whim. And so, that's the world Abraham lives in. And yet, what does God do? He turns around and takes that as an occasion to make provisions for someone who would have been of no account, a slave woman, in the ancient world. But Hagar and Ishmael don't fit into the scheme of Isaac and the prophecy in the same way. So both purposes are realized by this activity.
Okay. Well, we thank you so much for your email. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Actually, we do have a couple lines open, which is rather unusual in the second half of the show. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN, if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. I want to tell you for just a moment here about something that I find very valuable as a part of the EWTN family, and that is Catholic News Agency, CNA. It's the only fast, reliable, and free Catholic news source that actually brings blogs and stories and opinions and so much more to your fingertips. For the latest Catholic news, turn where I turn. Visit CatholicNewsAgency.com. It's an online service from EWTN News, and you know that it's trustworthy. CatholicNewsAgency.com. Back to the phone lines here at 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion. Here's Stan now in Harrisburg, PA, listening on Holy Family Radio. Hello, Stan. What's on your mind today?
Thank you for taking my call. I was listening to your show. I love your show. I wanted to ask you, in Genesis 1 and 2, where God creates male and female, and then he reiterates that by creating Adam and then creating Eve. It seems like it's. I was just wondering about there was something that was like really repetitive, and I was just curious as like why that was so.
Yeah, thanks. Well, the book of Genesis actually contains two different narratives of the creation. And higher critics, actually think these are the two different oral traditions playing into the woven together history of the text. That's not necessary for our purposes. But I mean, that's other interpreters have seen that there's a divergence of emphasis here that's so stark that some people have imagined they may actually have been anticipated or preceded by two different textual traditions that flowed together. So why did God sort of piece these stories together into one narrative, given that they're so different? Well, in the same way, we have four Gospels. We have four different accounts of the life of Jesus and the apostles, and they have slightly different emphases. And therefore, you can read each of them in its own, both as part of the whole scriptures, but also as a standalone text that teaches its own theological message. And, of course, in Genesis chapter 1, there's no account of the fall. There's just an account of God's creation of mankind in his own image, and the creation of male and female, and the command to be fruitful and multiply. And that's a different message. That's a different message. It's complementary to, it doesn't contradict the account of the fall, but it has its own integrity. And I think it's a very important message, one that we ought to reflect on, that the world is good, that mankind and womankind are good, that human matrimony is good, that procreation is good, that mankind's dominion over the earth and the sea and the fish and all the rest of it is good and should be properly attended to and not exploited. It's a good message.
It is. Stan, thank you so much for your call. Hope that clears things up for you. Let's go now to Andrew in Columbus, Ohio, listening on the Blowtorch AM 820 St. Gabriel Radio. Andrew, what's on your mind today?
Hey guys, just a quick question. When Jesus is instituting the Eucharist at the Last Supper and changes it into his blood, I'm just curious, why does he then refer to the next time he'll drink of the vine with us will be in heaven if it's been into his precious blood? Wouldn't the vine then relate that it's just wine?
Yeah, thanks. That's ambiguous. The claim you just made about, this indicates that it's just wine. That's not clear to me that that's what it indicates. It's not clear that that's what he intended. In the same way, St. Paul says, as often as we eat this bread and drink this cup. Well, is he just talking about bread? No. Okay, so no. This is a figure of speech, and it's one that we sometimes have found in other contexts in church history of referring to the Blessed Sacrament under its appearance, simply, right? Yep. But he also says, this is my body. This is the chalice of my blood. So, the distinctions that we are accustomed to draw in defining the nature of Christ's presence in the Blessed Sacrament arose under conditions of controversy. How do we actually understand the nature of Christ's presence? And so the Church is now very precise in her language to avoid confusion. Christ doesn't deny in any way the Church's teaching. He's the foundation of the Church's teaching about his substantial presence, but he's not using that scholastic vocabulary. Because he's speaking in a different context.
All right. Andrew, thank you for your call. Let's go now to Cindy in Bismarck, North Dakota, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Cindy is a first-time caller. Hey, Cindy, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I'm needing some direction.
Okay.
I have a daughter who is Catholic, and her daughter also is Catholic, who is in 7th grade. This daughter, my granddaughter, has been having scary visions, the presence that something evil is going to happen to her. What my daughter has been doing is she has been going to an evangelical church with her fiance, who is not Catholic, and I think she's being influenced wrongly. She tells my granddaughter that it's a gift from God to sense the presence of evil and that the devil will have no power over you. And I'm like, I wouldn't tempt the devil. I would not I know he's got some power, and I don't know. How do I respond to this?
Yeah, I think that I'm with you. I think this is very irresponsible of your daughter because, first of all, she's assuming that your granddaughter's experiences have their origin in malevolent supernatural power. And I'd say that's unlikely. It's unlikely. There's a more immediate explanation, which is that she's having nightmares. Maybe she's having nightmares because she's going to an evangelical church that's hyper alert to the demonic and sees a demon under every bush. And they've put an irrational fear of the demonic into her that's causing her to have nightmares. And rather than addressing that, your daughter may be exacerbating it by encouraging her to believe that these dreams and visions and experiences have a supernatural origin, right? So that's problem number one. Problem number two is, let us assume for the sake of argument, and I don't believe this, but let's assume for the sake of argument that the granddaughter is actually under some sort of demonic influence. Well, telling her not to worry about it is not a good thing, right? Because it's worrisome. It's worrisome. That's why the church has prayers of deliverance and a ministry of exorcism. So we should never treat a supernatural power, benign or malevolent, in a cavalier way. Right? Can people be gifted with supernatural gifts, charisms, for the discernment of spirits? Yes. I mean, St. Paul talks about this, and we know there have been saints that have had this kind of charism. It's far from evident to me, and it's certainly not evident to your daughter, that that's actually what's going on in the life of the granddaughter. That is a very presumptuous claim that she's making, and seems just way overblown, unwarranted by the evidence, and it's bad spiritual direction. What can you do about it? That's a much harder question to answer, because it really depends on how much trust and intimacy there is between you, your daughter, and your granddaughter, and what she'll trust you on. If there really were a concern of some sort of malevolent influence, then the place for this granddaughter to be is in the Catholic Church. And I'm certainly not advocating this. Don't get me wrong. But, I mean, if someone is actually a demoniac or something, you take them to the Catholic exorcist. That's someone who's authorized by Christ with authority from the church to deal with that. But simple deliverance prayers are the way lay people handle these kinds of things. And prayer to St. Michael the Archangel is a great place to start. But I am concerned about the culture of this evangelical church that may be sort of hyper-charismatic or super-spiritualist in a way that is going to detach from reason and sound, prudent reasoning about spiritual and emotional and psychological issues.
Cindy, thank you so much for your call. We hope that's helpful for you and your daughter and your granddaughter. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go now to Mike in Omaha, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Hello, Mike. What's on your mind today?
Hi, good afternoon. My question is kind of a church traditional one. I've been studying the saints, and I'd like to know if or why and how Mary of Magdala is also considered the same Mary as the sister of Martha and Lazarus.
Okay, I hate to kind of wimp out on you here, but the question of the family relations of the Marys in the Bible is quite convoluted. There are multiple theories about how they all fit together, and it seems every other woman in the whole Bible is named Mary, right? So there's controversy in the interpretive tradition about which Mary is under discussion in any given passage, and if I try to recall all the different theories of lines of relation, I'm going to flub it. I mean, I apologize. So my recommendation, I would start with the Catholic Encyclopedia and just start reading the different theories of interpretation about which Mary is who and how they all relate.
Or even to get a quick answer from Father Mitch on Open Line Wednesday.
Okay, yeah.
Might also be a good one.
Sure.
Mike, thank you so much for your call. Interesting question here from Nabara, an email question. How do you defend the Trinity to a Muslim, especially because they don't believe Jesus was God or the Son of God? In addition, How do you respond to the objection, presumably the Muslim objection, that the Bible has errors, so therefore it cannot be trusted?
Okay, thanks. So, the way you defend the dogma of the Trinity to a Muslim, I think you begin by drawing a lot of distinctions about what Catholics do not believe. That's really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
And because a lot of non-Christians believe wrongly that the doctrine of the Trinity implicates us in tritheism or polytheism of some kind. And it's really important that we emphasize that Christians are monotheists. And the nature of the distinction in the Godhead that we posit, that we affirm, is not one, it's not a numerical distinction of substance, as if there were three things. And so these are fine distinctions that you have to draw. And, they look at you cross-eyed then, and you go, look, there are analogies in human experience of single, indivisible entities that have a singular nature in which there is a kind of multiplicity. And the best analogy comes from the highest element of the creation, namely the human person, in the experience of human consciousness. The subject-object knowing that a person has of his own state of consciousness is one that Augustine produces as an analogy for the Trinity. There's the knowing subject, me.
Mm-hmm.
There's the object known, me. There's the act of knowing, me. All right. These are three different relations that exist within human cognition and human awareness. That's not the Trinity, but it's an analogy that you can have, a multiplicity within unity that doesn't violate the unity of substance. So that's where you start. Now, the claim that the Bible has errors and therefore it shouldn't be trusted, if alleged by a Muslim, I would like to turn that around and say, would you abandon the Quran on the same criterion, right? And, it doesn't have errors. Okay, well, if I can substantiate that there were, would you abandon that on the same criterion? And if not, why not? And if not, then that's not a rational objection. And then if you want to do a side-by-side comparison, let's go for it, buddy.
Yeah.
Let's do it. But also keep in mind that Catholics have a different relationship to the Bible than Muslims have to the Quran. And so they're not perfectly analogous in the way they function in our religious faith. And we don't make the same kind of claims about them, too.
Okay. And we thank you so much for that. We're going to close with this question here. This is an anonymous text that just came in. How is the Catholic Church's discipline of priestly celibacy not in direct conflict with 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2?
Yeah, sure. So this is the command that an elder or a presbyter has to be the husband of but one wife, right?
Uh-huh.
That is absolutely, and that his kids can't be unruly and all that. That's the Catholic position. That's exactly what we believe. No polygamists should ever be ordained Catholic priests. And a married man who's ordained a Catholic priest, if he's got disorderly children and he's not one of the very probati, he hasn't lived an upright and exemplary life and can't take care of his family, shouldn't be ordained a priest.
Okay.
So we believe that. But Catholics do have married men who are ordained priests.
Yes, we do.
I'm actually sitting in the studio with me today is a friend and cousin of mine who's in Greenville, South Carolina at Dwight Longnecker's church. And married Catholic priest. And they just ordained another one in their parish, another married Catholic priest. So we got married Catholic priests. And these guys meet the conditions of 1 Timothy 3:2.
They do indeed. Thank you so much for your text. And Dr. David Anders, a fast-moving hour and a fast-moving week. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Tom.
We do the program Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern here on EWTN, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern and a best-of show on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of Charles, Ryan, and Michael McCall, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you again live on Tuesday here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.